Our title of our hangout today is Why Connected Performance for Government, Why Now? And our hostess is the wonderful 5-year director of Maryland's very successful state STAT program, Miss Beth Blauer. Beth, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks Bridget, and thanks everyone for joining us. My name, as Bridget alluded, is Beth Blauer, and I'm the director of GovStat, a business unit at Socrata. And I am very happy to join you today. I'm joined by 3 colleagues that have been working at already well-developed and matured and at different sort of levels of maturity, performance stat or performance management programs. And so I wanted to introduce them today very briefly before we get started. So with me today, I have Andrew Anderson, who is a transportation engineer with the City of Edmonton in their Policy Implementation and Evaluation Office. Andrew works on numerous strategic initiatives for the city for working and integrating his work into both budget analysis, performance measurement, and has been the leader in the first use of GovStat as an early adopter in Edmonton in the creation of their very highly acclaimed citizen dashboard, a tool that we love at Socrata. Also joined today by John Walton from the County of San Mateo. He is their Chief Information Officer. He's been in the county after a stint as the CIO for the City of San Francisco for 5 years, and is an award-winning digital government employee. Had created the Government to Citizen Local Government category was the award, and received many awards for your web and mobile services at all tools brought to bear while working in the Bay Area, and is now implementing a dashboard for both the citizens and internal government workers in San Mateo County to communicate how they are aligning their resources to some very lofty goals and aspirations. And then finally, we're joined by Wendy Korthuis-Smith, who is the Director of Accountability and Performance in the Office of the Governor in Washington State. Wendy has been at the forefront of this field for quite some time as the director and leader at GMAP, which is the Government Management Accountability and Performance tool that the state of Washington had used. And when I was working in the state of Maryland, we were always looking very closely at what Washington State was doing and really thought about them as thought leaders in this field. So I've been so honored and very happy to be working with the team in Washington State as they are thinking about what their sort of GMAP 2.0 with the future of performance management looks like in that state. And so very excited, and thank you all very much for being here with us. I just wanted to share with everyone a little bit about my background, but before we get started, just a few sort of housekeeping things I know Bridget covered, but I want to make sure we cover them again. We would love to make this a dialogue. This is our first in a series of webinars where we are really trying to establish a peer group for governments that are interested in being more data-driven and are really wanting to become active in a network of folks that are being data-driven and aligning data and information and resources that they have in their governments to the measurement of performance outcomes. All of the governments that are joined with us today have made great strides in doing this and are really leading the way. But there are many of you that are participating on this webinar in the audience that are also doing this work. And I want to make sure that we capture all of your input and that we let this peer network or peer group evolve over time. So your comments and your contributions are going to be really very critical to this conversation and making sure that we are capturing the things that you would like to learn about as well. A little bit of background about me. My name is Beth, as you know, and I am new to Socrata. I left government in August after being in the state of Maryland for about 12 years. I started off there as a probation officer. And when I left the state of Maryland, I was working as the de facto chief operating officer as the director of state STAT, the governor's performance management program, and the director of the governor's delivery unit. And I spent the last 5 years in the state of Maryland really understanding the power and value of being data-driven. And it's been, it was one of the best places. I love working in government. I hope that everyone that is working in government continues to work in government. I can't wait to go back and work in government at some point. But there are, I felt when I was there that there was very little by the way of a peer network for people who are doing data-driven work. And I really wanted to create that peer network. And so this webinar is our opportunity to start to create this peer network, to create this body of resources so that there is a platform for sharing best practices as governments begin to understand that it's not about if there's going to be a need to be more data driven in this new economy, but how and when will they be more data driven. And so the number one question that I get as I've been touring around the continent and soon the world, talking to governments, is just how do you get started? There's so much, it does seem like a very steep cliff on how you get started. And so I thought we would start today's webinar just asking that very question. I would love to understand from our participants on the panel how it is that your organization made the decision to be more data driven, and how it is, what is your story around just getting started and getting moving. So I'd like to start with Andrew Anderson from the city of Edmonton. If you could just talk a little bit about how your organization sort of got over that initial hurdle.
Yeah, I think for us it was really driven by the community, by the citizens in Edmonton. There was a couple of projects that were, even before we were doing our dashboard, that were about trying to understand city services in a better way. For instance, we had a snow clearing program and a street sweeping program, and a lot of the information about how the program was doing, it was through the media, and so those traditional channels were certainly something that we had been using. But then there was a large snowstorm that we had basically in 2009, 2010. And there was a real push then to try and improve communication, because the citizens were part of helping the city do the service. When you're talking about parking your car in a different place while they're trying to plow the streets and this kind of thing. So there was an initiative to respond to that from council to have more involvement, so public involvement and public communication. And so that was, I think, the very beginning for what we were doing as a transportation department within the city, of trying to make more information accessible to the public. And I think there's been a number of sort of small initiatives like that. And then ultimately last year when we were building the citizen dashboard, it was about collecting all of these pieces together and putting them out in a way that reflected the vision of the city, which was another major part. The city itself had deliberately set its vision. But I think for me, the start came from the grassroots. It came from people wanting to know how we're doing and how they can get involved.
Excellent. So I have one question about that. And what do you think is the most effective platform for sort of capturing that citizen sentiment? I think a lot of governments probably struggle with understanding how to connect with their citizens, and particularly how to get them as part of that feedback loop. So how would you say you did that in Edmonton?
Well, the feedback loop is a really hard part, because generally we have sort of traditional channels for feedback are more sort of complaint based, right? You can call a number and we'll take your complaint and we'll try and do something about it. But I think with some of the online tools, there is a more chance for sort of a dialogue. So I think we have used social media well in trying to sort of build that dialogue, but I think it starts with information. So when we provide that information that anybody can use, that anybody can manipulate and reinterpret, it's a shift in the way that we do things, because we're not used to doing that. But we're releasing the information and letting the message being crafted by somebody else. But I think that's part of the dialogue, is just we can start with the information and then we can adjust based on what we hear as feedback.
And one of the things that I'd like to point out is that you've been very transparent about your performance. So I've been monitoring the citizen dashboard since its launch, and there's definitely been some times where some of your greens turn to yellow and even to red at a certain point. And so have you gotten any pushback publicly for being that open, and have you found it to be a challenge both internally in your government and externally when you're really being very very transparent about your performance?
Mm-hmm. I think there was a lot of concern internally about how that would play out, and people were concerned that if you put this out there, it's going to be a big story that we're saying we're red, we didn't meet our target. and that there's a problem. But in actual fact, I think people understand when some of these things aren't working well, and it's not necessarily a reflection of people not trying hard, right? Like it sort of made it a little more objective, I think. And we could have information like, we haven't finished the program, we're working on it. It started snowing again, and so we're still working through some of these issues. But I think that it has to start from a point of legitimacy. It can't be too processed, and I think that's what we tried to do with the dashboard is provide the sort of raw information out there and allow and people who aren't affiliated with the government at all to put some context around it. So one example we had was a phone app, a mobile app that they built using the data that was available, so people can have their road construction as they're driving. So it's not something like in the past maybe we would have tried to develop something like that, but I think if we focus more on delivering the service and providing the information and letting the public use that information, I think that's one of the places that we've had success with our open data program, and then the citizen dashboard as being one of the examples of providing that information.
Great, excellent. All right, so John, why don't you tell us a little bit about the decision making that went into the Measure A dashboard in San Mateo County and the process that you are about to embark on?
Sure, Beth. The idea of performance management government goes quite a ways back here in San Mateo. It's really one of the things that attracted me when I came here is under the leadership of the county manager's office, John Maltby and Raina Farless. They had really set a vision back in the 90s about aligning government performance to community outcomes and community indicators. And they had a shared vision 2025 model that they had created, and were tracking how government's performance was affecting or getting them near those goals. And so I thought that was fascinating. And then when I had the opportunity to join the county and work with them more directly, we saw the GovStat dashboard. And for us, it does two things. And one of the reasons we selected it and decided to use it was, a lot of times in government, things aren't as automated as we'd like them to be. So you set a performance metric and you want to provide reports or results to the public over time. But if you don't have the right systems in place, it can become very laborious, very, very time consuming for staff to compile all the written records and keep track of things. And we felt like we had the data. We felt like we had some good systems behind the scenes, but they were unconnected and disparate data sets. And so for us, using Socrata and the GovStat platform, we're able to automate that process now. And that's really important to us because we can provide, I think, more timely information and the speed people expect to see results. So instead of telling the board or the public they're going to have to wait weeks or months to see how a change affects the performance or something, they can actually start to see it in real time. And also, I want to go back to something you and Andrew were talking about. I think the transparency piece, I think, is critical because I think with a dashboard like GovStat and using the philosophy of open government and open data, there's a lot of times the public questions government in terms of, are we really getting our money's worth? And so for us, that was the segue for Measure A. We asked the public to trust us to make improvements by approving a half-cent sales tax. And tax is a very politically charged conversation anytime you tax the public. And so we really wanted to create a foundation for that where people could see that they were really deriving direct benefit from that half-cent sales tax, that their money was going to good use. And again, the idea was, rather than do it after the fact, we wanted to have departments submit ideas on things that they thought they could do to improve government service, but in those submissions already have thought through the process about how we're going to track it, what data do we need, how are we going to display the outcomes, how are we going to move the needle, and think all of that in advance. So then it feeds directly into the dashboard, and it creates that transparent process where it's not just us creating a hard copy report presented at a public meeting and people have a lot of questions about, well, are you sure it moved that much? It doesn't seem like that in my neighborhood. They can actually see the raw data. They can drill down into the Measure A dashboards and actually see, is crime decreasing? Is the quality of the roads going up? Is the education for their children improving? And they can see how we set the metric, how we derive the metric, the data that feeds that metric, and they can start to participate then with us in talking and having that dialogue about, this is a good idea, and we see our money being well spent, and we understand what you're trying to do, and we have faith in government that you're doing the right thing to make things better in the community.
Absolutely. So that gets to that whole idea of connected government, right? So this is a connected government platform. The idea from our perspective was to make sure that there was an opportunity not only for you to create connection with the public, but also one of the points that you brought up, John, was how do you create that connection with the people who are responsible for doing the work, right? The implementers. And I think oftentimes when we're talking about open data, we're not just opening the data to public, we're opening the data for cross-agency exchange of data. And I've seen historically that a lot of data initiatives sort of replicate the traditional silos of government. Instead of freeing data to be shared, it's just freeing data for that particular use case. And so the idea is, and that I'd like to hear more about from everyone is sort of how both internally do you think that open data is going to benefit your agency efficiency, and then how that plays out into results on the ground and that connection. And so you're focused both in two ways in San Mateo County on that sort of operational internal use of the platform, and then obviously for that transparency piece. Is there anything of that transparency piece that you think is going to be challenging both internally and also for the public to understand exactly what you're trying to communicate, and what are the things that you're what are the things that you're thinking about in terms of enhancing your connection with the public?
Well, that's a good point. I will say, one of my observations has been as you implement these types of tools or open data or dashboards or open government initiatives, it's really a change in viewpoints or in psychology about how things work. Governments organize themselves traditionally very hierarchical and very siloed or vertical organizational structures. But what people don't realize, probably externally, and what we fail to take into account internally sometimes, is you really deliver services horizontally. Most services, you have to cut across the entire organization to really effectively provide any service. If the roads aren't in good condition, then the ambulances can't drive on them to respond in time. And so people don't really think through what are all the nuances of government service that it takes to actually derive an outcome to the public. And so I think two things. One, using it internally, we'll start to see then the interrelationships, because we're going to use it as an internal performance management tool as well. When we describe what we want the outcome to be to the public, will cause us to reflect more internally as we start to share data sets and set goals and see that, well, I can do my best effort in my department to move the needle, but I need the assistance of these other departments and how they contribute to the service as well to really make a substantial difference. And so I think it'll start to break down some of those historic cultural barriers internal to government to really get that cross-departmental view. And externally, I think, again, to the psychology part of it, I think government sometimes is nervous or concerned about exposing data that's not perfect. And so there's this feeling that, well, we don't want to put something up and show how we're deriving data if it's not perfect already. And so you can kind of get it stuck in a paralysis state of trying to make the data better and better, never actually expose it. And I think one of the things we need to really think about in government is actually the public can be a real assistant to us in improving that data and making the data better over time. So I don't think we have to strive for perfect data out of the gate. I think by exposing the data and actually engaging in that dialogue and creating that collaborative environment externally with the public can actually work more directly with the department saying, hey, we noticed something here in the data, or we noticed there's some errors in the data, or have you considered these other data sets, where we can actually have this two-way conversation with the public directly through our data portal and through our performance dashboard portals with GovStat, and actually find ways to collaborate with the public to get them to help us see things that maybe we don't see internally, because sometimes we're too close to the problem and you need that external perspective.
Yes, certainly that additional bandwidth can be very helpful. And so, Wendy, I would love to hear a little bit more about how it's going in Washington State. You had a very mature performance management program, and so you're sort of enhancing that real very hardy base that you already have, and thinking about being even more data driven. So I'd love to learn a little bit more about how that transition is going, and what are what you think are some of those key ingredients to help other governments sort of answer that question of how do you get started.
Mm-hmm.
So we were very fortunate in Washington State to have Governor Gregoire, who was our former governor, come on board. She was with us for the past 8 years, and we have a new governor who's on board as of January 16th this year. So as Beth mentioned, we are transitioning from one governor to the next and looking at how we might do things slightly different. Governor Gregoire used to work at the Attorney General's office. She was the Washington State Attorney General, and she looked at CityStat and CompStat programs previously and said, there's something really unique here that we should be bringing to the state government system. And so she brought to the Attorney General's office what she called AgMap, which was similar to what she created here in Washington State around GMAP. And so GMAP, again, Government Management, Accountability, and Performance. And it was really important that we provided a systematic way to look at our data. We knew that it was important to make decisions based on the data. We had so much data. And so trying to figure out, what data is most valuable to the citizens. So early on, they did some town halls and some citizen discussions to find out really what do citizens value in terms of government providing certain services. And that really created her platform around priority areas. And she created 8 priority areas, everything from education to healthcare to public safety, economic vitality, and so on. So we were really about, from her point in 2005 until she left in January, trying to keep that process as mature as possible. We had a focus on an agency perspective within each of the agencies, but I think more importantly, and what I hear from the other folks, is looking at where the silos can be crossed in certain areas. So for example, Washington State Patrol is very interested in making sure that if there's an accident on the roads in Washington State, that we have the data about that road collision, whatever happened, the accident. So we have accurate information. Our Washington State Department of Transportation also wants that road cleared as soon as possible so that they can make sure that people are moving, they're not being delayed in traffic. And so how do those two groups work together to make sure that when we look at collision data on our roads, that we're doing it as efficiently and effectively, and yet meeting both the needs of those agencies in terms of their mission? So we've transitioned from more of an agency perspective to a policy perspective. What I've heard also from some of the speakers is, we look at activities that are happening within the different agencies, and it's important to link those activities when we have limited resources to what are the most important things that we should be doing. One example that we have is we use logic models to start with activity-based things and then look at what's the ultimate outcome. And so having conversations where, for example, we might be providing training for in the prison system for inmates, and then asking that question within our culture, why are we providing that service? Well, we're providing it so that they have a marketable skill when they leave prisons, so that they can get a job when they leave prison, so that they likely not recommit, and we look at our recidivism rates for that. And so really with the data-driven decision-making in Washington State, it's been about maturing that process over time. With the transition of the new governor, we are looking at taking it even further, so building on the best of the best. And so having that opportunity to say, what are other states using, what technology is out there to help move us forward with this, and really how can we take it to that next level. We are known for transparency in Washington State. If you go to our website, you'll see all of the forums with the governors, with her agency directors, having those conversations. Some are interesting and some are very unique conversations. But ultimately it's about public are invited to those forums. They can watch on TVW, which is a station that is in this area that allows people to watch real time, or they can go on YouTube and watch after the fact what those conversations look like. So a great emphasis on transparency. I think, at this point in time with the new governor coming on board, we're asking those questions about how we've done it currently in the past and what makes sense to do it in even a better way as we move forward. I did want to comment also on the question about transparency with the yellow, red measures, for example. And I think one of the things that has helped us in Washington State is not only creating a culture about performance management, but trying to create a lean environment. And so when we look at lean management principles, it's about ridding waste. And they really encourage us to say, you know, we can anticipate that there's going to be 50 to 80% waste in any process that we do. And so being okay with that and trying to share that with people and have them come in and help problem solve and how we can get rid of that waste. Very important to have customer feedback into that process. So we're not there yet, but we're working on that piece of it.
And so, you know, you bring up a really great point about leadership. And I can tell you that from my experience in Maryland, I don't think it would have been possible to run StateStat, for me to have the gravitas to make decision makings based on data, or to do really honestly to implement the program successfully at all without having Governor O'Malley, you know, at my back, constantly reinforcing that this is the way that we're operating in government, and this is how we're going to be making those decisions. And he was constantly reinforcing that this is his initiative and this is his approach. How important do you think, as you are someone who's now moving in through a transition period, how important is leadership to supporting a performance management program and really setting that tone?
Yeah, it's critical. It's at the top of critical success factors. We could not have done what we've done in the past 8 years without Governor Gregoire, for example. And looking at now with Governor Inslee, who's our new governor, his commitment and dedication to performance management and lean is also critical. There's so much activity going on in states, as with, I'm sure, cities and counties, and people get pulled in so many different directions. And we have really held to the line that when the governor's in the room having those conversations, the agency directors need to be there also at that leadership level having those conversations. And sometimes they want to delegate that out because they've got ledge hearings or other types of activities that they're involved with. But there is that commitment that it's actively engaged, leader to leader conversations, and this is their book of business of what they own. And so trying to keep that at the forefront as we transition will be really critical, and I've seen great signs from our new administration that that's critical for them as well.
I couldn't agree more. I also think that one of the things that I want to sort of shift to is operationally. How is it, you know, and maybe Wendy, we can start with you. I experienced a totally wide range of adopters in the enterprise of government. So I like to sort of think about them in certain buckets. And I had those people that were really immediately identified the value proposition that's offered by being more data-driven. Mm-hmm. But I also ran into what I call data hoarders, people that were in my organization. And you mentioned something really interesting when you were responding to the first question, which was that you have so much data. And I think there's a lot of people, particularly at the top of government, that don't even realize how much data they own and how there is a rich resource in that data. And so I'd like to understand from you kind of how difficult it was to sort of loosen the grips from some of those data hoarders, and then also what were some of the barriers or sort of perceived barriers that you encountered when you were implementing GMAP, and some of the things that you think you'll have to revisit now as you're moving towards this blend of performance stat and lean management?
Mm-hmm. So one thing that comes to mind is that the data hoarders love perfect data. They love perfection typically. And so when we're asking for information, we had to start out by saying, start with something. And, you know, they might in the past want quite a bit of time or a long runway to try to pull everything together in a way that feels sophisticated and completely analyzed and mature. And we're saying start somewhere and we'll build on it. And that was really uncomfortable for people, not only exposing their data, but exposing data that maybe wasn't looking the way they wanted it to, or it wasn't perfect data in their mind. And so that was really a challenge to let them know that this is about starting and building and growing, and it will mature over time, but it's better to start today and build on it than wait until we can achieve perfection with the data and then move forward. So that was a critical piece in that. What was your second question, Beth? It was...
No, just any other barriers or perceived barriers. You know, you're going through transition, and so I think that you're going to revisit a lot of that. And I think that getting the data is one thing, but this is about culture change, right?
Yes.
This isn't just about you know, the central government, and I think Andrew and John, you probably can attest to this also, this isn't about just building a dashboard. This is about aligning data and information to how you're resourcing problem solving. And so there's some folks that, you know, the status quo is a much more comfortable space for them to live in. And how is it that you, and they're typically the people that you have to capture, or else it will make implementing change very difficult.
Right.
So how do you engage people in a positive way, in a collaborative way, to get them connected to a data-driven approach? And that's something that I'd like to hear also as John and Andrew, if you have anything.
So I would just add that with the GMAP program in 2005, it was rolled out in a pretty aggressive fashion, and there were measure teams that were pulled together to create the measures and the data pieces. I wouldn't say it was as collaborative as it could have been. We're trying to be really sensitive to that right now and say, how do we use principles of change management to make sure that people feel like they own this data, and yet they're sharing the data in an open environment, and that we're having those collaborative discussions about the data. So one example right now is we're looking at agency enterprise measures across all agencies that we would focus on. And we're working with our deputy directors group. So we have directors of each of the agencies, 27 executive cabinet folks. Each of them have a deputy director. So we're working with the deputy directors, who are really the operational folks, to engage them in those discussions, and then create a subgroup who's going to actually come up with a list with us about what some of those measures could be. And then using a governance process to make sure that we have recommendations that can be sent forward to be actual decisions made by the governor and the chief of staff. And so trying to make sure we have the people engaged and in the room, and that's really important to them. In the past, we ended up in this interesting nuance where people felt like we the governor's office, owned the data pieces that we were showing as part of the governor's 8 priority areas over time, and that they've lost control of it, so that they weren't involved in being able to change it or modify it or improve it. And so we did some work early on when I came on board to make sure that we had clearer accountability and ownership of that data piece, and that agencies own it in alignment with the governor, and having that reported on.
I want to put sort of on the parking lot the discussion around governance, because I think that that's really incredibly important. I'd love to hear, Andrew, from you, what some of the barriers, or sort of the perceived barriers, that you faced when you started embarking on the creation of the Citizens Dashboard were.
Yeah, no, I think what you were saying about it really being a change management process and part of culture change, I mean, that really resonated for us. For us, we had a lot of internal work had been done. We had what was called our Transforming Edmonton Committee, which was something that was struck by the highest level of in the administration, so that was our new city manager. So we really had a lot of endorsement that we needed to have a clear vision of what we were trying to do within each department, and how we were going to work together under this concept that was called One City. So the idea is we have all these siloed departments, but we needed to think about what is the vision for how what is the way Edmonton is going to move forward. So we had a long-term strategic plan, which was called The Way Ahead, and then we had other series of ways: the way we live, the way we move, the way we grow, the way we finance, the way we prosper. And so between all of these ways, it was about inside of the city talking about a conversation of, okay, so we see how we fit into the big picture, but then what is our individual section or our individual area? What are the results that we're trying to achieve, and how do we measure and report that? So there was a lot of internal work about setting performance targets, and then ultimately this was a series of targets that went to our council these were our corporate performance measures. So this is something that we had, it's our 3rd year now that we've been reporting corporate performance measures. So when it came to doing a dashboard, it was about leveraging some of that work that we had, it took a long time to go through and start to work, and really help areas own the measures, because they do own the results. So if we're trying to impose a measure on them, that's just not going to work. So we needed to have this process of developing these metrics, and then when we were talking about a dashboard, it was about making this information timely, so that really and making it reliable and accountable. So it really was the culmination of a lot of that work that had been done through what we were calling the Transforming Edmonton Committee at the time.
Yeah, timely data. I mean, that's one of the tenets of StatStat and the performance stat models. And I think that that's, timely data is something that government isn't used to using, right? I mean, we're used to these long, protracted lags on validation of data, whether it's, getting your data validated from an entity at the federal government or something, a process that you have internally set out. And so I think that it's a shift that is happening more and more frequently when we've got things that are producing more timely data, and that there's a reliability that is associated with the production of that data. But I think that there is a huge fear factor there, right? You've got people that get really freaked out by having to release a little bit of that control. Before I move on to John and to hear a little bit about some of the things that he's anticipating in the process in San Mateo County, I just want to reiterate to the listening audience that we're taking questions. So whether you want to tweet them at us or you want to send any of that information through the YouTube chat, please just let us know if you have any questions or any territory you want us to cover while we've got everyone here for the next 20 minutes. So John, what are you facing in San Mateo?
Well, it's interesting listening to Washington and Edmonton talk about what they're going through, because it is, there's a lot of similarities. I would say, you've already touched on a lot of the organizational change management you go through in terms of, you have to have the executive level sponsorship. That's invaluable. You have to have the department heads or the leaders of the individual organizations buy into it. The two related things I would say when you get down past that level, though, is, it is about the data, right? A lot of times, when I talk to other CIOs or IT directors, there's kind of the probably not unusual idea that if you implement a new system, it's going to magically generate reports and magically change performance just implementing the tool. And what we're really trying to stress as we start out here and we're trying to do training and education and communication is it's really about the data. And it's not a single department project in the sense that a lot of times a dashboard project or an open data project will be seen as the technology department's problem or the performance department's problem or the mayor's office problem or some organization. They own the project, so it's their problem to make it successful. And it's their problem if there are road bumps in how the results look and how the performance measures move. And we're trying to create that culture at down to the staff level. People really see, to Andrew's point, how their individual actions and how their actions of their divisions and departments really feed into the data so that they're excited about keeping the data up to date. And we're redefining what the central IT department's role is in these projects. In this day of software as a service, it was so easy to just, get a contract with Socrata and stand this up in less than 30 days, right? So the software wasn't the problem. So we've overcome the traditional hurdle where we'd have to go through a 2-year process of implementing the tool. In the meantime, everyone has forgotten why we're doing it and has moved on to something else. So the good news now is it's really easy and to stand up a user-friendly, powerful tool almost overnight. So then really the role of the central IT department has to be, well, how do we become that change agent? How do we get people excited about it? How can we help them realize that it's going to make their job easier, their job more relevant, their job more trackable to the performance of government? And so that's a big shift for a technology department. If you're a CIO or an IT director, it's invaluable to have that executive sponsorship and leadership, and I'm certainly fortunate to have that here. But then we sit and we talk in our senior meetings in the technology department. It's interesting. It's not about we have to buy hardware and we have to do a software upgrade. It's about how do we communicate out more? Where can we go meet with the department and figure out what data sets they already have? And it's not their problem to translate the data. Maybe our value add is to be that data translation agent for them, or data quality agent, or that data classification agent, and work with them and educate them and help them really see the power of the tool and explore the tool together to make it relatable to them. So it's really exciting in terms of, I think, not only just from the technology standpoint, but really kind of how it has caused us in government to sort of rethink our roles and responsibilities in these things. And again, kind of getting away from it's a single person or single department's problem to more of a team approach to delivering services at the end of the day, not just in moving the needle, but in ensuring the performance and success of the project from the bottom up.
Yeah, and I think so I when I was working in the state of Maryland, we I think one of the most biggest pain points for me is when I would encounter an organization, whether it was an agency or a program, that had sort of articulated a strategic plan, and they were sort of being maliciously obedient to that strategic plan, and that they've even, like, to the extent of maybe legislating elements of it, or to really focusing on you're taking a hardline regulatory approach to the implementation either of a big big scale programs. And there was a lack of agility, a lack of the ability to be able to respond or react to how things were going based on the data, right? By way of example, we had this very regimented approach to the way that we supervised probationers in the state of Maryland, and it was really, very, rule-based. But a lot of it had been articulated before there was the internet, before there was, the ability to do kiosk check-in for low-level offenders, before there was ability to be able to really take a very high level look at your resources and make sure that you were actually aligning those resources with the most dangerous offenders, the ones that were really the biggest risk to your public safety. And we saw the same thing happening when we were looking at the environment, where we were offering programmatically, essentially, everyone can enroll in this cover crop program and get the same bang for the buck. But really, we knew exactly what farms we needed to have cover crops on their farms in order for us to have the best water quality in the Chesapeake Bay. And the data allowed us and afforded us that agility, and that visibility into the data allowed us to be able to align our resources to actually solve our problems. And part of the data hoarding, and part of that sort of people who really dug in, was that they had spent a lot of time, and I think a lot of governments have done this, focused on the articulation of strategic planning instead of thinking about implementation, and then how are you going to review that implementation. And I think that as an IT manager, you probably are well aware of the sort of 10-year IT plans that get outpaced by technology, as soon as they're completed. And so the idea of being more agile is one of the things that I think emerges when you start to be familiar with the data that is actually driving some of the results in your government. But I do think that there are other best practices. There are other ways of alignment that that emerge. And I was wondering, maybe Wendy, if you've got some ideas or thoughts about what are some of the best practices that emerged, when you were working in GMAP, and then as you were moving into that transition, or as you're moving into that transition now into Lean and also into GovStat.
I had to unmute. My apologies. So, we've talked about a few of them in terms of kind of the best practices, and I think that, making it clear that it's a leader-to-leader discussion at all times, and that this is about the work that's been done. One of our challenges over time was we had so many measures come up in the sessions that we ended up with a collection of measures that somewhat became outdated, not dynamic measures, not timely measures perhaps, and there was a sense that we couldn't sunset those measures. And so what is the process for bringing measures in and then sunsetting and using and being agile with what you specifically need to look at? So that was a challenge for us from a kind of a process perspective and a belief perspective that some people had about making sure we had really clear baselines on everything that went back 10 years, so that you could look at trends. Well, being agile means you may not have access to trends from 10 years ago, but you start looking at the data that's relative and important. So we had to do some work on refining the measures and making sure that we are focusing on the measures that add value, that are the most important measures for us to focus on. Our technology was a limitation. When we start looking at the adoption of lean management within our government, one of the project or programs that wasn't lean is our GMAP program. And partly because we used a data view system, it was a customized system. They did a great job with it in terms of making it work at the time, but it became static. We weren't able to use dynamic data. It became there was a lot of waste in terms of agencies having to take data and re-enter it into this other system, and that created a lot of resentment for people in terms of trying to be lean and value added and making sure we're looking at the right stuff. So The barriers, that we really struggled with early on, the top ones, were around trying to get to the right data, making sure we're having the conversations about the most important stuff, and then the technology that supported that was really challenging for us.
Well, hopefully we'll be able to help you a little bit in that department. But I also, we have a question that's coming in from one of our external participants, and the question is, can you speak to the importance of geospatial visualization within any performance management system? And I'd like to speak just briefly. StateStat, when we started, was adopted from CityStat, which was adopted from CompStat in New York City. And the geospatial component of what we did was critical. Everything that we looked at, on the map. And people, and I think that this gets back a little bit, Andrew, to what you're talking about earlier, was people want to know what's happening in their community. They want to know how, I think that, they're interested in government performance, but they're really interested in how government's performing, on their street, at their school, in their community. And so, I think the map is a great way to deliver information. It definitely provides that context, but it also helps you with your own decision making, because the map will allow you to see sort of where the delta is between those that are in need and those that are receiving the services. And so, and maybe Andrew, this goes back to you, because you have a lot of geospatial data on the presence of your site, and obviously in transportation you use a lot of maps. I'd love to understand from you how important geospatial, the view of geospatial data is to you.
I think geospatial data, and it's more than just visualization. Like what you're talking about is it's about connecting people to really local data, and geospatial gives you that great ability to scale down to a particular level. You don't have to just look at the big picture, which is, I think, sometimes when you're talking about performance management, you're generally looking at, are we achieving our target? And I think, but when you're looking at geospatial data, it allows so much more richness. You can go in and you can really dig around, and you can look for different patterns. And there's so much that goes into producing that kind of geospatial data. Like for us, one of the other projects that we're working a lot on is transit. So that's another huge initiative for the city of Edmonton, is shifting the way that we move. So that's more trips by transit, more trips using bicycles. And so you have to be able to help people understand how they could do that. And so one of the projects that has been ongoing is it's called the Smart Bus. So the idea is you'd have real on-time information when you're sort of waiting for the bus. You could have on your smartphone an application that would tell you, when the bus is coming. And so tying that direct tool that somebody could be using, it's not necessarily a performance measurement tool, but then sort of rolling that up and saying, this is the kind of service that we want to be able to deliver, and then being able to, at the end of the day, probably your performance metric is, what is our total type of system functionality, or what is the overall share split between cars and transit. But geospatial allows that real richness that you don't get with just a simple metric.
And John, do you find that, or when we look forward, I know that spending some time in San Mateo County recently, that you definitely have a very strong geospatial program in the county, and are looking forward to integrating that into your dashboard view of some of those resources. How do you think that will enhance the connection that you're making with the public?
Well, I think it's critical because, like we were talking about before, I think at the end of the day, it's about citizen engagement. And what you and Andrew are saying, I think, is definitely true. We set these goals about how we want to improve county-wide typically. So you have a performance goal for the entire county. We have a very large spatial county, all the way from the bay out to the ocean. And so it's a very diverse county. And so to say we're going to reduce crime by a certain percentage or increase education county-wide is one thing. But at the end of the day, what people want to know is, well, in my neighborhood, in my area, is crime going up or going down? And if you don't have that geospatial element, which is why we see the GIS data, the geospatial element of data being so important, again, they're not going to feel like they can trust government to make the changes, because you should be able to see, it's not just I moved the big dial. It's also, well, things either did improve or didn't improve in my immediate vicinity. I can see the changes. I see that crime is going down. I see that buses are more on time. I see the trash is being picked up more frequently in my neighborhood. And I think that's what you need to do. You need to set, of course, these sort of higher level goals of how you want to move the entire organizational performance. But then you need to use those geospatial tools over time to let the public see how it's affecting them personally. And also, as government, tailor those programs over time. Because if you just try to move the big needle all the time and you're not really making a difference in those hot spots, if you look at a heat map or a hot spot of where the real problem is, and you don't fix congestion at a bad intersection, or you don't fix crime, or if you don't fix education problems in a specific district, then you're really not doing your job. You're just trying to meet an artificial metric to make it look like you're hitting a goal, but you're not really solving the specific problem that's causing the overall grief for the community.
Right, and that's the sort of richness of those indicator data, where you really have to understand what to measure in order to move the needle on those larger areas. And we actually just got a very relevant question from the listening audience about how do you deal with imperfect data. I think we've all probably come across a data set that made our stomachs churn. I know I have, certainly. And the first thing is that in the spirit of this being a getting started conversation, I really want to emphasize that when we first got started in Maryland, we started internally. We didn't start off with a transparency website where we just took all the data that we first got and pushed it out publicly. We spent some time to understand the data and the challenges of the data and the context of all the data that we were working with. And some of that data was a lot better than it was perceived even by the data owners themselves. But some of that data was just flawed. It was deeply flawed. It was really data that was probably be reporting in one context or another, but it was the beginning of a conversation of how to improve a process around both data collection and how that data is being used in other places. And so just the mere exercise of trying to get started helped us understand some real vulnerabilities in what we were doing. And so I would love to hear maybe from, for any of you really, but Wendy, let's start with you about how you deal with, essentially bad data or data that's flawed.
Mm-hmm. So with the portfolios that we work on with agencies, there's a maturity level that gets built over time in terms of the data. And so we start with very imperfect data and work our way up. We have analysts in our office that work with each agency, and each agency has an analyst that they submit the data to us. We look at the data from sort of a face validity standpoint, and we ask questions about the data. In some cases where we've had to push back and say, we're not seeing how this connects, or you made a significant improvement during this quarter and tell us why, so we ask those questions. There are times where the data is just bad. I mean, it is just bad, and you just got to call it what it is. And
contextualize it,
yeah,
say why it's bad, and that's what we ended up doing, is just saying, this is bad data, this is why it's bad, and then this is this path forward to improving it.
Yeah, so awareness is the first step, which is great to be able to be consciously aware your data is bad, and then figuring out how do we have a plan forward to make it better.
Yeah, maybe we need to have like a 12 steps of data recovery, when you're faced with a bad data set, this is what you do. I mean, that might actually be very helpful. Andrew, did you have something that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think that the issue of sort of bad data, it's especially harder in government, right? Like if you're in industry, you have such a cost tied to data, and so you're much more willing to accept whatever you need to make a decision. Whereas in government, there's this higher level of accountability, and so there's a higher desire to have perfect data, even if it is something that couldn't be, reasonably affordable. I think for us, it was a lot about focusing on relevancy, like some of what we've talked about, because traditionally a lot of the information that was being collected was about efficiency metrics. So people were so focused on outputs over inputs. And I think there's already so many people who are, so many resources available who are working on data that over time, eventually you will be able to just have not just good data, but the right data. Because I think there's enough resource. It's not a question of resources. It's a question of, are we spending a lot of time doing certain parts of the data program that aren't giving us the biggest bang for our buck. And so I think that's, we're always kind of constantly looking internally at how we can do things better. For us, it was about a discussion about relevancy over efficiency.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, we have several questions that are coming in from both Twitter and also on the YouTube chat room. So I just want to let everyone know that if we don't get to your questions, that I'm happy to also respond to them individually. And I know that we have a hard stop in about 4 minutes. And I did want to wrap up with a few things. But one of the questions that is coming across the line is whether or not there are cost savings from collecting performance data. And I don't think we need to go to. I think we could dedicate a whole chat around the return of investment, both not only on the sort of the traditional GDP model, but also on what I think of quality of life metrics, because I think, we were able to save millions of dollars in overtime spending, consolidate services, really understand in getting back to those sort of lean principles and how do you thin out your spend and how you realize. But I also think that in terms of the, reductions of crime, improved academic performance, getting people in jobs, there are a lot of quality of life measures that are also associated with this being more data driven. What I wanted to end on, and maybe John, if you can quickly before you have to jump off, because I know that you definitely have a very hard stop, is just what do you see as your path forward, and what are your goals for the sort of next level in your use of data in San Mateo County?
Well, it's really the engagement piece, and I'll just say, to the questions about cost savings and good data versus bad data. I mean, I think all of those things really come down to an engagement, a conversation internally that the data can help you have, and externally. I think the more you expose, whether it's good or bad, and I would say, there is no bad data, there's only inaccurate data that could be made better. That's really the key in kind of the journey of why we do all these things, right? It's not just to have a dashboard, it's not just to have a pretty picture or a map. It's really to create that conversation internally and externally with the public about what are we trying to achieve and how do we achieve it together. So for us, dashboards and performance metrics and open data, it's all sort of part of the bigger open government initiative that we're undertaking here in San Mateo and that's going on all around the country and the world. It's how do you more directly connect with the public and get them to feel like a partner with you in delivering those services rather than standing on two sides of the road throwing rocks at each other. How do you come together to make things better, and how can data be sort of a unifying theme in having a common dialogue about what really drives performance at the end of the day? And performance does have a cost relationship, and I agree. I think you could have a whole chat about data and cost and performance over time.
Well, maybe that's a good recommendation, and one of the things I want to do before we wrap up is let everyone know, both participating in the conversation and those of you that are listening in your offices or homes, that we are recording today's webinar and it'll be available. And also, if you have any, feel free to continuously use the #GovStat hashtag if you have any recommendations for more questions. Some of the issue I feel like we barely scratched the surface today, and I want to make sure that we're respectful of the sort of time limitations. But this is the idea is to build out this peer network and to provide this resource and to get this conversation as enriched as possible. So if there are other ideas on how we can make this better, how we can reach out to more, capture more of your the areas that you're facing as you go through and the challenges of undergoing or transforming a government using data, let us know. #GovStat. You can follow us at Socrata on Twitter. And then before we get to that 3 o'clock mark, I want to thank Andrew, John, and Wendy. You guys were awesome. So thank you so much for hanging out with us today. And we barely got to finish, and I've got so many more questions. So I really hope that you'll join us again for another webinar, but we are up at that 3 o'clock mark. So I don't want to hold you past time. So I just want to say thank you to everyone.
Thanks, Beth.
Thank you. It was great.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Thank you, Beth. This was
all right.
Thanks.
Yep. See you all soon. Thanks.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
Bye.